Today we're here with some leading political scientists. We have Emily Eakins, George Hogley, and then Henry Olson. I'm not going to go into their bios, which are impressive, but they are on the app and you can read them there because we want to make sure we have enough time for conversation as possible. And today our conversation is really about what is polling and survey data telling us about the state of support for individual and public freedom and what can we learn from it going forward. So, this is meant to be very conversational, very much a living room conversation. I'm going to ask some questions of each of these distinguished guests, but then we are going to have time for audience Q&A too. So please keep queuing up your questions and let us know what you have. Just to kick us off, and I actually would like to just hear from each of you, starting with Emily, what is like the top lines of what the data and the polling have been telling us recently when it comes to where individuals in America are in terms of their support for individual and economic freedom? Like, what's the top line? What's the latest?
Thank you, Kathleen. It's great to be with you this still morning, right? It's still the morning, afternoon. I wanted to ask a clarifying question. Are we talking about Americans overall or about kind of the Republican electorate, Democratic electorate? Like, who are we talking about?
It's a great question. So first, I think we're talking about Americans overall, but we are going to dig into more specifically right-of-center voters as we progress in our conversation.
So I think this is something you'll definitely see in polls consistently conducted, is that Americans will definitely say they're for freedom, whether we're talking about freedom of speech, free markets, and whatnot. People will say they're in favor of freedom. But when you get specific, that's when things get a little bit tricky. In the research that I've done, I would say that pretty consistently there's about a group, it's a minority, that's 20 to 25% that has the intuition that's more, has a free market intuition, a free speech, free market intuition. I'm not saying they're libertarian or I'm not giving them a label, but I'm just saying in the research that I've done that they're pretty consistently kind of have that intuition that government isn't accountable in the same way that businesses are accountable to their customers, or that how individuals are accountable to the people they have to pay bills to, and so forth. And they also have a strong sense of a stronger sense of fairness as proportionality, this idea that you should reap what you sow, that if you work hard, you should be rewarded, and then if you make bad choices, you face the consequences of those actions. Now, a lot of Americans have those values, but when you put it all together, I'm saying there's about this 20 to 25% that have a strong sense, this intuition sense, that government isn't the best mechanism to achieve a lot of the goals that we want. Now, beyond that, though, polls do show that a lot more than just 20 to 25% of Americans tend to take pretty reasonable views on a lot of issues when they are confronted with more information about the trade-offs associated with various policies. Now, let's keep in mind, most Americans aren't paying that close attention to politics, and they shouldn't have to, right? A free country should be a place where you're not busy wasting your time on politics. For those of us that like it, we can spend a lot of time talking about it. But more generally, what I found in my polling is that Americans are actually quite reasonable about public policy when you give them more information about the trade-offs. So this is beyond the 20 to 25%. This is more like a majority of Americans tend to be very reasonable about public policy when you tell them how much something will cost. So let me give an example of this. Things like paid family leave. That's something that most Americans say that they would support the government creating a federal program to provide parental leave. I think it's like 3/4 of Americans think that this is a great idea. Almost every public policy shopped around DC is almost always presented like it's this cost-free, benefits-only proposition. The polling I've done finds the same. But when you follow up and you say, well, what if this very program were to cost an extra $250 per year in higher taxes? What if it costs an extra $450 in higher taxes? You ask different groups, different amounts, and you can compare their answers. As soon as you start inserting any kind of cost at all, the results flip. And majorities of Americans oppose the creation of a lot of these large-scale federal entitlement programs. And so the reason I bring this up is that while I think you've got a smaller group that intuitively gets that you don't trust a lot of these large government programs to work very effectively, that most Americans actually get it if you give them more information, but they're often lied to. They're often not given full information. And unless people like us tell them that information, it will be hard for them to make good choices when it comes to the ballot box.
Great. So, George, same question to you. Where are people today? What are the top lines of what you're learning? Anything you would expand on from what Emily highlighted?
Well, what I would say is that I don't disagree with any of that, except I would emphasize that, public opinion, including from Republicans, in terms of, specific questions of limited government. Oh, I should turn this on. Okay. Anyway. Limited government is not very popular. I mean, it just really isn't. Even like, if you ask Republican voters, ask the electorate more broadly, do you favor higher taxes on high earners? Big majorities will say yes. Do you want higher corporate taxes? Big majorities will say yes. But the thing to note is that most people are not paying that close attention to politics. This notion that every economic policy has to be sort of, polled and focus grouped just really isn't true. I think that it is a lot of the cultural stuff that gets people out to the polls. One thing to note about the American public is that it tends to be symbolically conservative, but operationally liberal. Like, they like the way Republicans talk, but they tend to also like the things that Democrats recommend. But again, once you get into office, I would say that a free market candidate or politician, has a lot of leeway to pursue the policies that they think will bring prosperity. I mean, people remember Reagan fondly, not really because of the specifics of his policy agenda, and more so, oh, we got rich while Reagan was president. And I would say that that is really the route that free market candidates should pursue, is get elected and then do what's going to work, not necessarily what polls well and is popular.
And I would echo these concerns or these statements. What I would say is that American voters, including large supermajorities of Republican voters, want economic security and economic opportunity. They may distrust the government in theory, but they actually am happy to have the government help them, in fact, in areas where they can see a discrete benefit. And with respect to liberty arguments, you always have to remember they exist in the context of other arguments, of non-liberty arguments. Take the battle over Second Amendment rights. That's polls that I was looking at. The most recent Economist YouGov poll asks about, it was taken in the aftermath of the Maine shooting, and huge majorities of people want to ban semi-automatic rifles and ban assault weapons, including a huge majority of Republicans. I'm sure if you ask the Second Amendment question, large majorities of Republicans would back that. I've seen that. The question is, in these cases, they see it as a safety issue, not as a liberty issue. Today's Wall Street Journal has a poll out about, do you think that the federal government has a responsibility to ensure that every American has health coverage? It doesn't say provide, but ensure. About 60% of Americans and large numbers of Republicans believe that. Because there you see it as a security issue, not as a liberty issue. But the one thing I would say is that you can, while I think generally George is correct, that people like markets, they like the opportunity, they like tax cuts, they like that against the backdrop of an extensive government support network. Take Alaska. When Governor Dunleavy came into office in 2019, the state faced a 25% budget shortfall because Alaska has no state income tax, it has no state sales tax, and it runs its government largely off of petroleum revenues. And he said, okay, let's cut government by 25% and restore the annual payment that you get per person that has been getting cut to pay for government. And he was basically saying, you will get an extra $2,000 per person. So a family of four gets $8,000. All you have to do is cut government by 25%. We're in year 6 of the Dunleavy administration, and they're nowhere close to passing it. In Alaska, they've made small cuts. Every year he puts up a budget that says, here's the option if you want the money back. Every year the legislature refuses it. And that is an indication that people, and we saw the same thing in Kansas in the middle of the 2010s, that people were willing to take tax cuts as long as it didn't severely cut public services. As soon as they thought it was going to severely cut public services, conservatives lost primaries and they overrode the governor's veto that repealed the tax cut. So it's both. And this is why smart Republican governors cut taxes on the margin rather than cutting government to fund taxes, because that's where Americans and Republicans are.
So I think these are really good points, and I really like the framing that you use, Henry, of security versus liberty. And when a different frame is used, I really agree that that's how voters are thinking about it. I do want one little thing, George, that you mentioned, and this will make this panel more fun if we don't all agree. So in political science, it's true. There's this long literature about this idea that Americans are symbolically conservative, meaning they'll say, I like small government. But if you ask them about specific policies, they will be, quote, operationally liberal because they'll support everything under the sun that academics ask them about. So one issue with that is that when those questions are posed to Americans about new programs, not cutting programs like Henry's talking about, but adding new programs, these political science academics, which we come from, that's our world, don't ever mention how much it costs you. They never mention that. Rarely. And so when you do, and I've done this time and time again in the polling that I've done, it changes the result. That doesn't mean that Americans would pay nothing. So for example, on the first example I gave you on paid leave, we came up with 3 different cost points for a federal paid leave program. We used Kristen Gillibrand's Family Act as kind of, we didn't tell respondents that that's what we were polling, but we were essentially using that as the model. And there were 3 different possible costs. $250 more per year, which its advocates would say it's all it would cost, $450, and then $1,200, which, by the way, is actually more accurate. If you split respondents in a survey sample into 3 different groups, you don't ask them about every single option because that would wear people out. You ask them about just one, and you ask them if they'd support or oppose all these benefits if it costs them $250 more per year, $450, or $1,200. People would pay $250 more per year for what is essentially an insurance program of a paid leave program. But when you get to $450, they say no. And when you get to the more realistic number of at least $1,200 a year in higher taxes, they say no way. And so on a lot of these, and it's not just paid leave, I've done this on regulations in the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, a lot of different policies, as soon as you inject any trade-offs about new spending, Americans often say no. Not always no, but often say no. But I do think that Henry is correct, that when it comes to cutting spending, people will say symbolically, oh yeah, we should cut wasteful spending. They think that the government wastes 50 cents of every dollar it spends. But when you get specific about a program, then all of a sudden it's like throwing grandma off a cliff, and it's very hard to do. So I think that the way for people to do this is to try to slow the growth of spending. Let's not create more programs than we have, because once you have it, it's really hard to do anything to reduce its scope.
Thank you. And so let's dive in a little bit more towards, the right and right of center voters, which you asked about earlier. And when you look at some of the issues of the day and kind of even maybe evaluating some of those trade-offs, what specific areas have traditionally Republican primary voters shown skepticism or resistance to, more pro-free market or free market arguments? That's new. That's maybe things you're seeing new, even within some of those trade-off conversations that is emerging and that's different than it has been in the past. So we'll start with Emily, but I would love to hear from George and Henry as well on this.
I'll be shorter since you've already heard a lot from me. I would say there are 3 areas, but one in particular I'll just focus on. Globalization. A lot of voters don't really know exactly what all of that means. But I think that it's become a symbolic issue for, do you care about Americans and do you put Americans first, or do you put corporations and people from other countries first? That seems to be how the framing is, and I'd be very curious to hear what Henry thinks about this, because we've talked a little bit about it. But I think that there's definitely a divide. When Trump ran in 2016, we saw Republican primary voters support for just free trade, as, you know, not giving them any details about it, free trade drop. And this is in panel data. And what that means is you ask the same people year after year questions, and you see how those same people's attitudes have changed. So those same people, support for free trade was, let's say, about 60% positive. With Trump's running in 2016, it dropped to maybe something like 40%. But then it bounced back again. And so what I think that tells us is that on these issues, Trump talks a lot about it, and the way he frames it certainly is convincing to a lot of primary voters to be more skeptical about free trade, globalization, and so forth. But if he's not actively talking about it, results kind of revert back to where they were before.
One thing that I've noticed in recent data is we have started to see a decline in attitudes among Republicans, more negative attitudes towards both big business, but also more positive attitudes towards unions. You know, and I've got opinions on that, but we don't need to get into. But in any event, you know, there is some, you know, what you might call kind of a populist turn in the electorate. But I also think this has been pretty dramatically overstated. Like, the people who thought that that 2016 represented this major sea change in opinion on economics, or really anything else, I think were mistaken. I mean, when you think about, you know, how Trump ran in 2020, he didn't run on a populist agenda, or at least didn't run on a populist record. I mean, his main achievement was, you know, tax cuts that any conservative would have promoted and been proud of, as opposed to, you know, infrastructure or whatever he was talking about in the 2016 election.
What I'd say is that the Republican voter base support for the think tank consensus, the think tank business consensus, was always dramatically overstated. What happened before Trump was there was no candidate withstanding who was willing to break with that consensus. Trump, not being part of that community, broke with that consensus, and the people who pre-existed, who were suspicious of trade, who would prefer protecting entitlements over cutting government, found a champion. And this was news to people in the think tank political consultant world, and 7 years later, it remains the genie they want to put back in the bottle. But the fact is, the Republican electorate has, if you look at polls, particularly Pew typology polls, you will find substantial support for government programs, and, you know, again, not necessarily supermajority support, but large levels of support among Republican voters. And what's happened in the 7 years since Trump became president is that a number of center-right economically, but centrist to center-left cultural voters have moved away from the Republican Party. And this is part of a global phenomena. This is not an American or Trump-specific thing. I can bore you with details in every developed country. If you want to be bored, see me after the event. And has been counterbalanced by people coming in who are centrist on economics, who want that security and opportunity, but a little more security, who are center-right on culture. And so I did a poll of 2020 Trump voters in 2021. You ask them, what would you prefer? Do you think trade is bad for America? 40% say yes. Of Trump voters, 60% say trade costs American jobs. It's not a majority, but you can't run a coalition and ignore that. 63% agreed with the statement that it is better to keep Social Security benefits level for future retirees, even if payroll taxes have to go up. And that was 60% among self-described very conservative voters and 63% among Obama 2012, Trump 2020 voters. That's the Republican coalition, and that hasn't changed very much. That's been the case all along, and now people are finally, slowly, beginning to realize they have to deal with it.
So we'll follow up to that. You know, George, I'm interested in what you have to say about this, but Emily, Henry, also pipe in. knowing that this is mostly a academic researcher think tank audience we have here and who's probably going to watch this later, what do you think, if as people who are often looking at trends in public opinion, who are kind of in this data very regularly, what's the thing that you think is just ignored time and time again, that you're like, the data is telling us this and we're ignoring it? What would you say that is? And like a just like a very succinctly, what is that?
Well, I would say the most important trend that's not being discussed is actually a trend that's not happening, and that is the supposed trend of the radicalization of the Republican Party, this notion that the GOP in the electorate has swung far to the right. And, there are plenty of people on the right, politicians, activists, media figures, who welcome this and think it's great and think, okay, we're in charge now, we run the party, and now, we need to become more like the paleo-conservatives or more aggressively identitarian or maybe Christian nationalists or something. But the fact of the matter is that the voters themselves have not moved. And in fact, if we're looking at sort of attitudes for different demographic groups, sort of group relations in the U.S., all the trends in terms of feelings towards other groups has been generally in a positive direction. I mean, the public has not become more nativist, not, at least if we're looking at trends over time in something like the GSS. The nativism kind of peaked in the 90s, and it's still lower now than it was. Attitudes towards Muslims actually went up among Republicans over the Trump years. So this notion that half the country has gone completely crazy into sort of alt-right or QAnon or nonsense stuff that, the progressive media likes to highlight is not showing up in the data for me.
Anything to add, Henry or Emily?
I think generally there's a lot of things that are being ignored by social scientists and pollsters because they're almost all from the center left over to the far left. And so they're framing questions always in their perspective. So center right perspectives are almost always overlooked. But one that I think ought to be studied more is the question of religious intensity and religious observance. That even in questions like exit polls, you rarely get any more questions about that. And it's a very strong predictor of certain beliefs. And one of the things that you see internationally is, and I think there are some support for that in like the Democracy Fund study that you did, which is that if you identify as a Christian but you never go to church, you are the group that is likeliest to be supporting populist sentiments. But you have to tease it out of data, or you have to find it in places like, I've found it in French surveys and Italian surveys, but because people don't ask it, you rarely see it in America. And I think if people understood that better, they'd understand some of the things that are driving this populist moment better.
Yes, to just add some to Henry's point, the core constituency of Trump voters in 2016, this is back when, if you recall, there were maybe 16 candidates running for office in 2016. So when you had 16 choices and Trump was your favorite, people really were unique. People that were voting for Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Ben Carson, Jeb Bush, very different flavors of the Republican Party for sure. So the ones that were the core constituency for Trump were the most likely group of all of them to say that being a Christian was very important to their identity. They were the most likely group to say that, but also were the least likely to actually attend Christian religious services on Sunday. So what does this tell us? I think this tells us something about identity, that being a Christian is more about how they think of themselves as their identity rather than some sort of religious practice. And then there was one more wrinkle to that, which is if you look at just Trump voters and how frequently they actually attend religious services and their policy views highly correlated. In fact, the more frequently you attend church, the less likely you are to agree with Trump on immigration issues, and kind of all these issues related to immigration and identity. So I think there's definitely something that's very important there. I'd also add one thing about a trend that's being overlooked. So often it's true that the media focuses a lot on the Republican side, and I've heard this hypothesis a lot that the Republicans have shifted far right. The data, at least among constituents, doesn't seem to really support that. But the group that has moved are people that are voting for Democratic candidates. Democratic constituencies have shifted a lot. And in particular, they've shifted on matters of race, and the size of government. And so when it comes to issues of race, where you really see a shift is an idea that every disparity that can be measured is completely due to systemic issues that are causing those disparities. There's a series of questions that are used to measure that belief, and that's where you've seen a very steep shift among Democrats. And that correlates with greater support for a more for a larger welfare state, essentially. So that's where the big shift has been. And so when I think people have said Republicans have shifted very far to the right, it might actually be that they've shifted to the left. And so the distance is greater, but they have misunderstood what caused that increase in distance.
That's very interesting. So a follow-up to that, like as you talk about, and Henry, I know you've studied a lot of like the evolution of the GOP party and whatnot. When we think about these kind of changing demographics, and there's been a lot of conversations around like, well, are voters basically changing? And you think, well, actually, they're not changing that much. They're changing a lot on the left. Question. I am getting to a question that is, when we look at this, what insights do you have now about like what the future of the GOP is going to look like? How much is populism going to play into that in shaping that direction, especially in light of like maybe the voters of the right aren't changing that much?
So what we're seeing in the United States is part of a worldwide phenomenon. And the political order of the late 20th century was formed in the aftermath of World War II around questions of economics and foreign policy. Culture was not in dispute in 1950. And we created a left-right continuum based on that. If you were more in favor of negotiation and you were more in favor of a larger welfare state, you tended to be on the left. The opposite, you tended to be on the right. What's happened in the last 20 years is that that's breaking down. It's breaking down because culture on many dimensions is a new and live question. It's breaking down because the foreign policy questions no longer revolve around one clear adversary, the Soviet Union. And it's breaking down because of the failure of the Washington Consensus to provide dramatic, continued economic growth for super majorities of citizens in developed countries. And so the question that people as a political strategy has to ask is who is open to the widest majority of questions on the center-right, understanding that the center-right is not simply a liberty coalition. It has never been simply a liberty coalition. And the answer to that is the people who are most open to the most questions on the center-right is increasingly a blue-collar, multiracial constituency that is different than the older one. Efforts across the world to basically try and shift center-left on the economy and prevent the drift of upscale voters to the left have split their parties. That's what happened with Brexit. And we saw an example of that about 3 weeks ago in Australia. They had a referendum on a culturally signal issue. Give the indigenous people of Australia, they call them Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders is the official term, a unspecified voice in the Australian Constitution. It lost 60-40. Old center-right constituencies that are upscale and educated gave yes a stronger vote than they gave the Conservative Party candidate in the last election. Blue-collar constituencies that historically backed the center-left Labor Party, over 50% of the Labor Party voters, 50% of the Labor Party voters left the Labor Party to vote no. This happens everywhere. It happens on climate change, it happens on homosexuality, it happens on religion, it happens on globalization versus nationalism. The old center-right voter, if you are upscale and economically successful, does not want to be in the same party as a party that is open to culturally right elements. And they're willing to accept more state intervention in the economy to get their cultural objective. So the only solution for the center-right is to move downscale because those people are actually open to economic freedom as long as you give them economic security.
I agree with all that, but I would also just caution, center-right parties anywhere. But I think it's a real problem, this trend of college-educated people fleeing the right of any type of right. Yes, a vote is a vote, regardless of anybody's other attributes. But I'm a little bit concerned of the flight of basic human capital from the center right. The notion that we're just going to be a party of truck drivers now. Like, well, their votes are great, but who is going to be actually running for Congress and filling those important staff positions and writing policy, and I fear that the populist turn, to the degree to which it's been taken seriously, is hindering the possibility of effective governance even after elections are won by the center right.
I think those are both very good points. And I think the only thing I would add is that's a concern that I've had, is if the parties kind of tilt in their dimensions in such that there's no economic freedom party and that it is purely about immigration, globalization, culture, then I think we'd really have lost something. Because I think the free market system is what made America a great country and the reason why so many people want to come here. We don't want to kill that engine. And so I think part of what I'm interested in trying to figure out is sometimes economics can be a little bit tricky. And politicians can be tricky as well. When they sell a program to people, it sounds great on paper, but will it actually work? Will it actually help make Americans' lives better? And so what we have to do is figure out ways to communicate to voters how free market policy solutions, and we should mean it because it should be true, because I think it is true, make their lives better and help make America a shining beacon and a great country that people want to come to. So we want to make sure we don't forget that in this process and come up with policies that can really do that.
To follow up on that, and then we're going to go to the audience right after this question. You've talked a lot about this meta trend you're seeing in externalizing problems, right? And we're kind of danced around this a little bit in terms of the security the Americans are seeking right now, and maybe even globally people are feeling right now. Why are we seeing more calls for people to attribute their problems to an external systemic factor? And then what can you do about it, right? What's the path forward?
There's been some fascinating data on this. If anyone's read the work of an academic named Jean Twenge, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. She looks at college students year after year since the 1970s, and there's a series of questions they ask these students. So different students, but the college age, same questions year after year. And what they do is they measure to what extent do you attribute the events in your life to being things external to you, happening to you, or within your control. Now, obviously, the truth is both matter, right? No one could say it's just one or the other. But the question is, what do you emphasize? And what is the healthier thing for you to emphasize, for us all to emphasize? Her research has shown that college students, year after year, more and more are attributing things to external forces. And in surveys, I include this battery of questions on a lot of my surveys. If you ask people, this battery of questions, average their responses, you kind of get a sense, are they more a person that attributes things to within their control versus outside their control? The more you attribute things to outside your control, the more big government programs you want, the more security that you want, because you don't feel like it's within your control to attain the security that we all need and want for ourselves. And then vice versa. The more you think things are within your control, the more free market attitudes you have, the less government intervention you think there needs to be in the economy. So I think this is a mega trend that I don't know what you do about it, because I think the causes are very complicated, but are going to make it harder to make that case, but it could also kill that engine that makes America a great country.
Could you restate the question just to make sure I'm accurately answering it?
Oh, sure. It was a question around, this meta trend we're seeing of people externalizing problems, like blaming systemic forces, blaming other forces than maybe individual forces for what's happening to them and the outcomes in their life.
Okay, well, I mean, one thing that's related to that, one of the more shocking and interesting things we're seeing from survey data is the dramatic decline in mental health outcomes among liberals. Conservatives are still pretty much where they've always been. There's consistently been a happiness gap between conservatives and liberals that has held steadily for decades, but this it seems as though this new trend on the left to always externalize all problems, and we are all just, helpless atoms being, dispersed by societal forces we have no control over, does not seem to be good for anyone's, subjective feelings of well-being. So that is one of the more, interesting and concerning trends I think we're seeing on the other side of the aisle lately.
I wouldn't disagree with what either of you said. What I would just say is if you're building a center-right coalition, and in a two-party system, every party is going to be a coalition, and it's going to contain entities that on some issues are diametrically opposed to each other. If you don't want that, support proportional representation, and then you can have 14 parties like they have in the Netherlands, and you can do your bargaining afterwards. That's how you get purity within a party. In our system, you don't have purity within a party. In a two-party system, you will always need large numbers of voters who feel that important elements of their life are not within their control. And a rhetoric that does not respond to that is a rhetoric that does not resonate with those voters. A failure to do that eventually means you support a Me Too type of policy, which is to say, oh yeah, well, we're for that, one says somewhat insincerely. We're fine with Social Security, but you don't really mean it. It buys, and then that always comes up when you try and change a program and you go back to your default pro-liberty or pro-freedom, pro-agency question. And I think that's the major reason why conservatives are not trusted to reform entitlements, because people who are in that middle, who would be open to a reasonable reform, do not trust us to value their security interests sufficiently. So a successful center-right coalition talks to these people, brings them into it, and moves them into an agency framework. I think that's what Ronald Reagan did. And I think that is what no one on the right has successfully done since.
Can you expound on that more?
Well, I could, but we only have 7 minutes
I was
left.
about to say, I really want a follow-up question for that, but we did promise audience questions, so we're going to do that. And then we do have like a lightning round at the end we're saving 1 minute for. So, Grace Marie, let's go to you first. Oh, here, I'll just...
Quickly, Grace Marie Turner Galen Institute. As you know, I labor in the field of health reform and talking about free markets and health reform, which we all know really would lead to more consumer choice, more competition, lower prices, all that. But there's really an increasingly a negative correlation to it. I have to think, what other words can I use? Patient-centered, pro-freedom. But the word free market, when you're talking about something that now is so much controlled by government, is increasingly difficult, even though I agree that markets are the center of really getting to the kind of freedoms we've been talking about in this conference.
Do you have a question?
That's my question. Is it just to talk about this question about free markets and how we can deal with this, with people having a hostility toward the term?
With 6 minutes, I'm just going to be really direct and somewhat blunt. People don't want they don't want choice first when it comes to health care. They want access. They want care. But it's access and choice within a backdrop that they have secure access to care. If you lead with free markets and choice, rather than lead with markets within the context of care, you have already lost your audience, because they react negatively to free markets, because what happens in free markets? Risk, possibility you won't get what you want, possibility, which they're fine with in a lot of areas of their life. But when it comes to your money or your life, the reason Jack Benny's old joke always got laughs is the idea that you wouldn't choose your life automatically is hilarious because it is nonsensical. In the context of healthcare, conservatives have to argue for access and secure access first, and markets as a means within that. Second, conservative healthcare reform for 20 years has not tended to do that, and hence it meets with, and that's why we couldn't repeal Obamacare. We could not speak that language. We had no policy that had uniform adoption within the Republican conference that spoke the language of care first and the language of choice second.
I'll pass on that one.
I agree with what Henry said. I think that when I hear politicians talk about healthcare, especially during the Obama years, it's like they would paint the outcomes that they wanted to just happen. Like, I want everyone to have access to healthcare. I do. This is what I think. I want everyone to have access to high quality healthcare. I don't want anyone to be excluded. How do we get there? And then they would just they came up with policies that they thought would get there. And so I think that this is to Henry's point. We talk about the end result that we all desire, and then we talk about the methods that we get there second, because it shows people that we share their values and their priorities.
Okay, question, Richard?
Richard Morrison, CEI. These big picture trends, both, as you guys have said, nationally and then, as Henry emphasized, internationally, all over the world, going more towards traditional conservative coalition to more populist, is fascinating that it's global. But I wonder how this works out in our system where we have 50 states, because how does it? Presumably, this will play out differently in different states, because the Republican parties of Rhode Island and Vermont are very different from the Republican parties of Texas and Florida. So will it have the big picture trends you're talking about, will they have differential effects in various states based on how many Republicans are in that state?
You know, in any American politics are set at the national level. And what we see in states with very few variations tend to be a reflection of the constituencies that are attracted to the national message. So the reason Republicans do well in Texas is because there are more of the sort of person who agrees with the Republican message nationally who live in Texas. The reason they do poorly in Vermont is the precise opposite. Of course, Vermont used to be the base of the Republican Party. Texas used to be the base of the. In 1988, Lloyd Bentsen is selected as vice president because Democrats have never won the presidency without carrying Texas. Well, now they can win the presidency and they don't even have to try to carry Texas because things have changed in terms of the voter coalition. I think you have to recognize that in a two-party system, the best you're ever going to get is temporary 60% majorities. And what you want is to achieve that, to set the framework of debate, to show what is possible, and then you grind out over the ensuing decades the unfinished agenda that is established by that. That's what Lincoln did, that's what Roosevelt did, that's what Reagan tried to do, but his successors didn't understand what he had actually set out. And I think that's the great unfinished agenda, is create a temporary 60% majority, create a new direction, and then grind out 55% majorities, understanding that you will not carry the whole country with you. And there will be places, much as the Northeast was very Republican during the Roosevelt era because they were resistant to that. The Plain states were very Republican. They were resistant to Roosevelt. That's going to happen when we form our majority. California is just not going to be part of the majority. Sorry.
This is somewhat related to that, but I do want to say I think that for the center-right, at least, probably the most successful action over at least the next couple of years is probably going to end up being at the state level. I think that gridlock in Washington, even if we have Republican wins next year, is probably here to stay. But this might end up being a case in which sort of the nationalization of politics may end up working in our favor. People are no longer paying much attention to anything else except whatever is the latest controversy coming out of Washington, D.C. So there actually may be opportunities for, particularly in strongly Republican states, to really pursue an ambitious agenda without drawing as much attention as might have been the case some decades ago.
So for our last question, just a little bit of a lightning round. for the audience and the people in this room who, are dedicating their lives to trying to make people's lives better, right? Through policy, through whatever means, right? Usually rooted in principle of liberty and virtue. What is your kind of you want us all to walk away understanding this? And I would say make it as succinct as possible so we remember it. What's your one takeaway you want everybody to leave this room knowing from what the polling and the data is actually telling us? Let's start. Let's go from Henry, and we'll go this way.
Voters want and have always wanted in the modern age a mixture of economic opportunity, which is markets, and economic security, which is government. Parties and entities that cannot convince people they care about the latter will not be trusted to provide the former.
I'd say that this group here is probably about as anti-populist as it comes on the right. But I would say, before we get too concerned about that, to note that there is and always will be probably an irreconcilable tension within conservatism itself when it comes to populism. I think conservatism properly understood in pretty much any context is going to be inherently elitist and accepting of inequality, but that's not a message that you can use to win. You're unfortunately, whether you think it's genuine or not, or good or not, populism, at least rhetorically, is an essential thing in a modern democracy. So the question is how do we balance actually trying to win versus trying to maintain, a consistent set of principles that are necessarily going to be at odds with each other. And so I think this is going to be the challenge, for certainly the rest of my lifetime and probably, indefinitely.
I'll just reiterate something that I said earlier about the importance of survey questions always including trade-offs. And if you are writing your own polls, go ahead and write the questions the way all the media companies do, which is no trade-offs, but then add a follow-up questions that include trade-offs so you can show the difference. And what I have found on CNBC, all the different media outlets that have covered the polls that I've done, they will include our polls that we've done, and they'll include the trade-offs with the original question. And they have to contend with that. So I would recommend doing that if you do your own surveys, or if you're, engaging with the media and you're talking about these issues and they present a poll and it does not include any follow-up questions on trade-offs, ask them, did you ask about trade-offs? How do Americans respond to that? And they really do have to contend with that. And so I just recommend doing that in polls or when you talk to media about polls.
So Emily, George, and Henry, thank you so much for lending your expertise today. Please join me in thanking our panelists.